The wind in the Arizona Territory doesn't just howl, it tells stories. It scrapes across sun-bleached rock and whispers through the bones of cattle long dead. On a night when that wind screamed like a banshee, it brought Martha Collins more than just dust and rain. It brought a man to her door. Not knocking, but bleeding. A man whose people had been at war with hers for a generation. An Apache warrior collapsed on her threshold with a bullet in his side and eyes that held the fire of a dying star. And in that moment, she faced a choice that would either sign her death warrant or redefine her soul. The year was 1883, and the world for Martha Collins had shrunk to the size of her 160-acre homestead, a patch of stubborn dirt carved out of the unforgiving landscape south of the Dragoon Mountains. It was a world measured in the ache of her back, the calluses on her hands, and the deafening silence left behind by her husband Frank, 2 years gone. The official report said a spooked horse and a poorly tied rope were to blame. Martha knew it was the land itself, a living thing with an appetite for men's dreams. Tonight the land was in a fury. A vicious autumn storm threw itself against her small, sturdy cabin. Rain came down in sheets, turning her dusty yard into a churning sea of mud. The wind pried at the shutters and moaned down the stone chimney. Inside, the solitary flame of her kerosene lamp cast long dancing shadows. Martha sat at her small pine table, mending a burlap sack with methodical practiced stitches. Each pull of the needle a small act of defiance against the unraveling chaos outside. A sudden violent crack of thunder shook the very foundations of the cabin and was followed by a sound that didn't belong to the storm. It was a heavy, wet thud against her front door. Not a knock. A dead weight. Her heart leapt into her throat. She froze, needle poised in mid-air. No one came calling this late, and certainly not in a storm like this. Sheriff Brody from Whispering Creek, 10 miles north, was the closest thing to a neighbor, and he wouldn't brave the washes for anything short of a murder. She reached for the shotgun Frank had left her, its cold, heavy stock a familiar comfort. Holding it ready, she crept to the door, the floorboards groaning under her weight. "Who's out there?" She called, her voice tight but steady. Only the wind answered, shrieking around the eaves. Taking a deep breath, she slid the heavy bolt. She opened the door just a crack, the shotgun's twin barrels leading the way. The wind tore the door from her grasp, slamming it wide open against the interior wall. The lamp flickered wildly, threatening to plunge the room into darkness. And there, sprawled on her porch, half in and half out of the deluge, was a man. He was Apache. There was no mistaking the high cheekbones, the straight jet-black hair plastered to his skull by the rain, or the simple leather breechcloth and worn moccasins. His skin, the color of rich terracotta, was slick with a mixture of rain and something darker. A deep, ragged wound wept blood from his side, staining the wooden planks of her porch, a sickening black in the flickering lamplight. He was unconscious, or close to it, one arm flung out, as if reaching for something that wasn't there. Every instinct screamed at her to slam the door bolted and pray he was gone by morning. He was the enemy, the boogeyman from settler stories, the reason men like Frank carried a pistol even when mending fences. The papers were full of tales of renegades, of raids and bloodshed. To help him was to invite death. The cavalry would call her a traitor. His own people, if they found him, might kill her just for being there. She stood there for a long moment, the rain lashing her face, the shotgun growing heavy in her hands. She looked at his face. It was younger than she expected, probably no older than her own 30 years. Despite the pain etched into his features, it was a proud, strong face. But what held her was the utter vulnerability. He wasn't a warrior now. He was just a man bleeding to death on her doorstep. Martha thought of Frank, how she had found him, broken and bleeding in the arroyo. She had been too late then. The memory was a physical pain, a hollow ache in her chest. She looked at the Apache, then back into the empty, silent cabin. Silence was a kind of death, too. She had had enough of death. With a curse that was half a prayer, she propped the shotgun against the wall. Gritting her teeth, she grabbed the man under his arms. He was lean but dense, with muscle, a dead weight that tested every bit of her strength. She dragged him inch by painful inch out of the storm and across the threshold, his body leaving a muddy, bloody trail on her clean-swept floor. With a final desperate heave, she got him fully inside and slammed the door, bolting it against the raging night. The cabin was suddenly small, crowded, and filled with the metallic scent of blood and the wild smell of the wet outdoors. The man lay on her floor, a stark and dangerous secret in the heart of her lonely world. The storm raged on, but the true tempest was now inside, locked in with her. For 2 days the world outside ceased to exist. The storm blew itself out, leaving behind a washed, clean sky, and a world dripping and renewed. Inside the cabin, however, the air was thick with the scent of herbs, boiled linens, and the ever-present shadow of death. Martha worked with a grim, focused efficiency that left no room for fear. She had learned doctoring from her mother, a woman who believed Providence helped those who helped themselves. She cut away the man's leather vest, her fingers surprisingly steady as they worked near the raw, puckered wound. The bullet was still in him, lodged deep in the muscle of his side. Getting it out was a brutal, bloody business. She sterilized Frank's skinning knife in the fire, fortified herself with a gulp of whiskey, and offered the rest of the bottle to the man. He was conscious now, his dark eyes watching her every move with a burning, feverish intensity. He refused the whiskey, his jaw set like granite. She pressed a folded piece of leather between his teeth. "Bite on this," she commanded, her voice low and firm. He stared at her for a moment, then did as she said. The surgery was a nightmare of grunts, sweat, and whispered prayers. He never screamed. A low, guttural sound tore from his throat as she probed and cut. But his eyes stayed open, locked on hers. They were a challenge, a testament to a will she couldn't comprehend. When the misshapen lump of lead finally came free, with a sickening squelch, he went limp, his body surrendering to the pain, and passed out. She cleaned the wound as best she could, packed it with a poultice of yarrow and comfrey, and bandaged it tightly with strips torn from her own petticoats. She moved him from the floor to Frank's bed, her bed a decision that felt both sacrilegious and necessary. For hours he burned with fever, muttering in a language that was as harsh and beautiful as the land itself. She sat by his side, bathing his face with cool water, forcing sips of willow bark tea between his cracked lips, and listening. She didn't understand the words, but she understood the tone. There were memories of battle, whispers of loss, and names of people he mourned. On the 3rd day, the fever broke. She awoke in her rocking chair to find him watching her, his eyes clear and lucid for the first time. The raw hostility was gone, replaced by a deep, unnerving watchfulness. He was assessing her, judging her. "Water." He rasped his voice, a dry rustle of leaves. She brought him a cup, holding his head up so he could drink. He drank greedily, then lay back against the pillows, his gaze never leaving her face. The silence stretched, filled only by the crackle of the fire. "Why?" he asked. The single word was heavy with meaning. "Why did you save me? Why risk yourself for an enemy?" Martha looked at her hands, raw and chapped from work. "I don't like to see things die," she said simply. "Not if I can help it." He seemed to consider this, his eyes sweeping around the small, sparse cabin. They took in the neatly stacked firewood, the clean but patched curtains, the empty space on the wall where Frank's rifle used to hang. His gaze lingered on her face. "They will be looking for me," he said. It was not a warning, but a statement of fact. Men with badges and men without. "They find me here, they will kill you too. I'm aware," Martha said, meeting his gaze without flinching. "What's your name?" A flicker of something, amusement, perhaps, or surprise, crossed his face. He was silent for a long moment, as if deciding what name she was worthy of hearing. "Among my people I am called Nantan." He said the name guttural and strong. "It means leader, to the white men who hunt me. I have many names. They call me Ghost, Demon. But the name my mother gave me is Kale." "Kale," she repeated, testing the sound of it. It was short, sharp, like a stone skipping on water. He nodded slowly. He pushed himself up on one elbow, the effort costing him dearly. A grimace of pain tightened his features, but his eyes held a renewed fire. The weakness was still there, but the warrior was re-emerging from beneath the veneer of the patient. He looked directly at her, his gaze so intense it felt like a physical touch, pinning her where she stood. "You have given me back my life." "Martha Collins," he said, and the fact that he knew her name startled her, though she supposed he could have heard it in town or seen it on a marker. "You do not know me. You fear me. But you will. Before this is over, you will know me." He paused, letting the weight of his words settle in the quiet room. The afternoon sun streamed through the window, illuminating the dust motes dancing between them. "By nightfall," Kyle said, his voice dropping to a low prophetic whisper, "you'll whisper my name." It was not a threat. It was not a promise of romance. It was a declaration, a prophecy. It was a statement of a truth she could not yet see, a future that was already hurtling towards them. It meant that by the time darkness fell on some day, in some way their fates would be so entwined, his identity so crucial to her survival, that his name would be the most important word on her lips. And in the chilling certainty of his voice, Martha felt a profound and terrifying premonition that he was right. The days that followed settled into a strange, tense domesticity. Kyle was a quiet patient, but his presence filled every corner of the small cabin. He was a piece of the wild brought indoors. He healed with a speed that astonished Martha, his body mending itself with the same resilient toughness as the desert plants that clung to life outside her door. Their communication was sparse, at first built on gestures and single words. But as his strength returned, so did his voice. He spoke English well with a low, measured cadence, as if he tasted every word before speaking it. He told her he was not Chiricahua, as she had assumed, but from a smaller, more isolated band of the Bedonkohe Apache, a people who had long tried to keep to the old ways in the high, hidden canyons. He never spoke of how he was shot, and she never asked. The past was a dangerous country, and they were two strangers navigating a fragile truce in the present. Instead, he asked about her. He noticed the way her hands were never still, always mending, cooking, cleaning. He saw the faint, worn lines of exhaustion around her eyes. "Your man," he said one afternoon, as she kneaded dough for bread. "He built this cabin." "He did," Martha answered, surprised. "Frank was good with his hands. He chose this place well." Kyle observed his eyes on the window that looked out over the small, protected valley. "Water is close. The land gives enough. It is defensible." The last word hung in the air. She had always thought of the homestead as peaceful, isolated. He saw it as a fortress. It was a stark reminder of the different worlds they inhabited. She told him about Frank, not the man who died, but the man who lived. the dreamer who believed they could build a life from nothing but sweat and love, the man who would sing off-key while he fixed a fence, whose laughter used to fill the silence she now endured. In return, Kyle offered her small pieces of his own life. He described the taste of roasted agave hearts, the intricate patterns of a coming-of-age ceremony, the feeling of the wind in the high mountains he called home. He spoke of his people not as savages, but as a community, with laws, families, and a deep spiritual connection to the very land Martha was trying to tame. He made her see the desert through his eyes, not as an enemy to be conquered, but as a living entity to be understood and respected. A fragile trust began to form in the space between them, a delicate bridge built of shared meals and quiet conversations. The fear Martha had initially felt was slowly being replaced by a complex mix of curiosity and a strange, unfamiliar sense of companionship. She found herself watching him when he wasn't looking, noticing the intelligence in his eyes, the economy of his movements, the quiet dignity that clung to him even when he was at his most vulnerable. The outside world intruded on the fifth day. The sound of an approaching horse sent a jolt of pure adrenaline through Martha. She looked at Kyle, her eyes wide with panic. He was already moving. Despite the pain it must have caused, he slid off the bed and flattened himself against the floor in the narrow space between the bed and the wall, pulling the quilt over the side to conceal him. It was a desperate, flimsy hiding place. Martha smoothed her apron, took a deep, shaky breath, and opened the door to find Sheriff Brody sitting atop his aging roan. Sheriff Wayne Brody was a man weathered by the sun and worn down by the thankless job of keeping the peace in a territory that had little respect for it. He was fair, but tired. He tipped his hat. "Afternoon, Martha." He said, his eyes already scanning her property with a practiced, searching gaze. "Just making my rounds. Heard you had a rough go with that storm." "It was a bad one, Wayne," she said, forcing a calm she did not feel. "Did some damage to my chicken coop?" "Heard that," Brody said, dismounting. He walked closer, his gaze lingering on the cabin door. "Mind if I have a sip from your well? This dust gets in a man's throat." "Of course." Her heart was pounding against her ribs. Every second he was here felt like an eternity. As he drank from the bucket, he spoke casually, but his eyes were sharp. "There was some trouble over by the San Pedro. A couple of prospectors found dead. Army patrol got into it with a small band of renegades. They scattered a few of them, wounded one for sure. A Bedonkohe brave. Bounty on his head is $500. $500. Enough to keep her homestead afloat for 5 years. Enough to leave this place and start over somewhere new. The thought came and went, leaving a bitter taste in its wake. "I haven't seen anyone, Wayne," she said, her voice a little too tight. "It's been quiet out here." Brody wiped his mouth with the back of his hand, his eyes never leaving hers. He knew her. He had known Frank. He knew she was a woman of principle, but he also knew what loneliness and poverty could do to a person. "Well, if you do, you be careful, Martha," he said, his tone softening slightly. "This Apache they're looking for, they say he's dangerous. Name of Cale. They say he's killed more than a dozen men. You see anything, you send word to me. Don't try to be a hero." He mounted his horse, gave her one last, long look and tipped his hat again. "You take care of yourself." Martha watched him ride away until he was a small speck against the horizon. Only then did she allow herself to breathe. She closed the door, her back sliding down it, until she was sitting on the floor, her body trembling. Kyle emerged from his hiding spot, moving stiffly. He looked at her. His face, an unreadable mask, but his eyes held a new kind of light. He had heard everything. The bounty. the name they had given him, a killer. $500, he said quietly. That is a great deal of money for a widow. Martha looked up at him, her fear turning to a flash of anger. Do you think I would— I think, he interrupted, his voice soft but firm, that you are a woman alone, and I have brought a war to your door. He was right. Sheriff Brody's visit had been a warning. The fragile peace of her small cabin had been shattered. The echoes from the canyon were growing louder, and they were the sounds of hoofbeats of searching men, and of a violence that was drawing nearer with every passing hour. The town of Whispering Creek was little more than a single dusty street, gasping for breath between two sun-scorched mesas. It had a saloon, a general store, a blacksmith, and Sheriff Brody's office, the four pillars of civilization in that part of the territory. It was a place where news traveled on the wind and settled in the bottom of a whiskey glass. 2 days after Sheriff Brody's visit to the Collins homestead, 3 riders entered Whispering Creek. They did not move like cowhands or prospectors. They rode with a grim, predatory purpose, their eyes scanning the ramshackle buildings as if sizing up prey. The man in the lead was tall and gaunt, dressed in a black duster that seemed to suck the very light from the air. His name was Bartholomew Bart Corrigan. He had a thin, cruel mouth and pale, colorless eyes that missed nothing. He was a man who had long ago traded his soul for profit, and the currency he dealt in was blood. His companions were a matched set of brutality. On his right was Pike, a mountain of a man with a tangled beard and knuckles like walnuts, his intelligence seemingly located entirely in his trigger finger. On his left was Weaver, a scrawny, weasel-faced man with shifty eyes and a perpetual sneer. They were not lawmen. They were bounty hunters, human vultures who followed the scent of death and desperation. They dismounted in front of the saloon, their spurs ringing on the boardwalk like a death knell. Inside, the idle chatter of the local patrons died down. Corrigan's eyes swept the room, and he smiled, a thin, humorless smile. "Whiskey," he said to the bartender, his voice like stones grinding together. He threw a silver dollar on the counter. "And information." Corrigan leaned against the bar, his presence radiating a cold menace that made the air feel thin. "We're looking for an Apache. Bedonkohe. Goes by Kale. A patrol winged him a few days back west of here. There's a handsome bounty from the territorial governor for the man who brings him in dead or alive." He paused, letting his pale eyes drift over the faces in the room. "We prefer dead. It's less trouble to transport." A few of the men shifted uncomfortably. Sheriff Brody stepped in from the street, drawn by the sudden silence. His hand rested near the butt of his Colt. "Corrigan," Brody said, his voice flat. "Didn't figure to see your kind around here." "Business brings me where it will, Brody," Corrigan replied without turning. "You have any news for me? I heard you were out sniffing around the homesteads." "I was checking on my people after the storm," Brody said evenly. "If I find your man, I'll bring him in myself. The legal way." Corrigan finally turned to face him, a look of pitying condescension on his face. "The legal way," he mused, as if the concept were a quaint anachronism. "The legal way gets you a pension. My way gets me rich." He took a sip of his whiskey. "Tell me about the Collins widow. Lives alone out south of here, doesn't she? That's rough country for a woman by herself, close to where our boy was last seen." "Martha Collins is a respectable woman," Brody said, his voice hardening. "She keeps to herself. She hasn't seen anything, hasn't she?" Corrigan's smile widened, showing yellowed teeth. "A lonely woman, a storm, a wounded man appears. It has the makings of a sad little story. Perhaps we'll just ride out and pay our respects. Make sure she's safe." "You'll do no such thing," Brody warned, stepping forward. "You'll not harass the citizens of this county, Corrigan." Pike Corrigan's large companion shifted his weight, his hand dropping to his holstered pistol. The tension in the saloon became a physical thing. The bartender ducked behind the bar. Corrigan held up a placating hand. "Easy, Sheriff. We're all on the same side here. We all want this red-skinned devil off the map. We're just more motivated." He finished his whiskey and set the glass down with a decisive click. "We'll be staying in town for a day or two, in case any public-spirited citizens remember something they forgot to tell their overworked sheriff." He shot a meaningful look around the room, his eyes promising reward for cooperation and retribution for silence. Then, turning his back on Brody, he and his men walked out, leaving a chill in the air that had nothing to do with the temperature. Sheriff Brody stood there for a long moment, his jaw tight. He knew Corrigan. He knew the man operated like a disease, infecting everything he touched with violence and greed. And he knew with a sinking feeling in his gut that Corrigan's instincts were rarely wrong. He had seen something in Martha's eyes, a flicker of fear and defiance that he had chalked up to a widow's hardship. Now he wasn't so sure. He had told her not to be a hero, but he was beginning to suspect that Martha Collins was being forced to become one, whether she wanted to or not. The vultures were circling, and her isolated homestead was right in the middle of their patient, deadly vigil. The next day, the air at the homestead was still and heavy, pregnant with unspoken tension. Kyle was on his feet now, moving with a stiff grace that belied the angry healing wound in his side. He had fashioned a crude but effective bow from a willow branch and some of Frank's old twine, and was methodically fletching arrows with hawk feathers he'd found near the creek. The sight of him so focused and purposeful sent a shiver down Martha's spine. The patient was gone. The warrior was back. "They're coming," he said, not looking up from his work. "I can feel it. The land is holding its breath." Martha felt it too, a nervous energy that made the hairs on her arms stand up. She kept glancing towards the northern track that led to town, her shotgun never far from her reach. The quiet of her life had been a comfort. Now it was a threat offering no warning of approaching danger. The warning came not from sight, but from sound, the rhythmic beat of shod hooves on hard-packed earth. 3 riders. They appeared on the ridge, silhouetted against the bright afternoon sky like omens. "Inside," Kyle said, his voice a low command. "Stay away from the window." Martha's hands were slick with sweat as she moved back into the cabin, her heart hammering. Kyle secreted himself in the dark corner, near the hearth, the new bow in his hand, an arrow nocked. He was a shadow within the shadows. She watched through a small crack in the shutters as the 3 men dismounted. Corrigan, the tall one in the black duster, moved with an arrogant saunter. He stopped at the edge of the porch, his pale eyes taking in every detail of her home. The neatly tended vegetable patch, the solid construction of the cabin, the single curl of smoke from the chimney. "Mrs. Collins," he called out, his voice smooth and deceptively friendly. "Bartholomew Corrigan. My associates and I were just passing through, and we heard you were living out here all alone. We thought we'd stop by and make sure you were all right." Martha took a deep breath, clutching the shotgun below the level of the window. "I'm fine. I don't need any help." "Oh, I'm sure a capable woman like you does just fine," Corrigan said, stepping onto the porch. Pike and Weaver fanned out their hands, hovering near their guns. "But these are dangerous times. The Apache are on the loose. A woman can't be too careful." His eyes scanned the ground near the porch, and a small, triumphant smile touched his lips. He had spotted something, a single dark drop of blood on a stone near the steps, a remnant from the night of the storm that Martha had missed in her cleaning. "Fact is," Corrigan continued, his voice hardening, We have reason to believe you might have had a visitor recently. A wounded man. An Apache." "You're mistaken," Martha said, her voice shaking slightly. "There's been no one here." Corrigan chuckled a dry, rasping sound. "Ma'am, please don't lie to me. Lying is a discourtesy, and I take it very personally. We know he came this way. A man with a hole in his side leaves a trail. Now you can tell us where he is, and we'll be on our way. My associate here, Mr. Pike, will give you $50 for your trouble." $50? A fraction of the bounty. An insult. "I told you," she said, raising her voice. "He's not here. Now get off my property." Corrigan sighed dramatically. "I was hoping to avoid unpleasantness." He nodded to Pike. "Check the barn." To Weaver he gestured at the cabin. "You check around back." As Pike lumbered towards the barn, Corrigan took another step towards the door. "Last chance, Mrs. Collins. This can be easy or it can be difficult. The choice is yours." It was then that Cale made his move. He didn't want the fight inside the cabin where Martha would be caught in the crossfire. He needed to change the battlefield. An arrow appeared as if from nowhere, thrumming through the air with lethal speed. It didn't hit Corrigan. It hit the wooden post right beside his head, the shaft vibrating with impact, the flint arrowhead burying itself an inch deep in the wood. It was a message. Corrigan froze, his pale eyes widening in surprise before narrowing into slits of cold fury. "So the dog shows his teeth." Martha used that moment of shock. She swung the cabin door open and leveled the shotgun at Corrigan's chest. "I said, get off my land." Corrigan stared down the twin barrels, his thin smile returning. "A shotgun? How rustic. You won't fire. You're a homesteader, not a killer." From the side of the house, Weaver shouted, "I found tracks, Bart. Back by the well." Suddenly the world exploded into motion. Corrigan dove off the porch, drawing his pistol as he fell. Martha, her hands trembling, but her resolve firm, pulled one of the triggers. The shotgun roared buckshot, tearing through the space where Corrigan had been splintering the porch railing into 1,000 pieces. From the shadows of the cabin, Kyle loosed another arrow. Weaver screamed a high, thin sound as the arrow pierced his thigh, pinning him to the ground. He dropped his rifle, clawing at the shaft. Pike, hearing the commotion, turned from the barn, pulling his massive revolver. He was a big target. Kyle was already moving, slipping out the back of the cabin. Martha, meanwhile, was frantically trying to reload. Corrigan, rolling in the dust, came up, firing. A bullet splintered the doorframe next to Martha's head, showering her with wood chips. She ducked back inside, her ears ringing. This was it. This was real. The abstract danger had become a terrifying reality of gunpowder and splintered wood. She heard Pike roar in frustration, firing blindly towards the cabin. Then she heard a different sound, a swift rustling movement from the side, followed by a choked, wet gurgle. She risked a glance out the window. Kyle had circled around. He moved with a predator's silent speed, despite his injury. He had come up behind the giant Pike, a knife in his hand. The fight was short and brutal. Kyle was a whirlwind of controlled violence, a stark contrast to Pike's clumsy brute force. Before the big man could even turn fully, Kyle's blade had found its mark. Pike staggered, dropping his gun, his hands going to his throat before he collapsed in a heap. Seeing his men taken down in seconds, Corrigan's bravado evaporated, replaced by a cold, reptilian survival instinct. He fired one last shot at the cabin to cover his retreat, then scrambled for his horse. Weaver, whimpering and dragging his leg, tried to follow, but Corrigan didn't wait. He leaped into the saddle, spurred his horse viciously, and galloped away, disappearing over the ridge in a cloud of dust. Silence descended, broken only by Weaver's pathetic moans. Kyle stood over Pike's body, his chest heaving, his face a mask of grim lethality. He looked at Martha, who was leaning against the doorframe, the heavy shotgun hanging limply in her hands. Their eyes met across the blood-soaked yard. They had won. For now. But it was a victory that had cost them their sanctuary. The first blood had been spilled on Martha's porch, and she knew with a sickening certainty that Corrigan would be back. And when he returned, he wouldn't be coming to talk. The sun began its slow descent, painting the sky in bloody strokes of orange and purple. The aftermath of the fight was a grim tableau in the fading light. Pike's body lay still and heavy in the yard. Weaver, his bravado gone, had been tied up and gagged in the barn, his wound crudely bandaged by Martha. She wouldn't let Kyle kill him, but she couldn't let him go. Inside the cabin, the air was thick with the smell of gun smoke and dread. They worked in tandem, barricading the door with the heavy pine table and piling furniture against the windows. Every action was precise, every word essential. The fragile bond between them had been forged into a hard, unbreakable alliance in the heat of the firefight. "He will come back at nightfall," Kyle said, his voice low, as he checked the tension on his bowstring. "He will think the darkness is his friend." "He'll bring more men," Martha stated, stacking boxes of shotgun shells on a small crate near the window. Her hands were steady now, her earlier fear burned away and replaced by a cold, hard resolve. As she moved about the cabin, her eyes fell upon Frank's old tool chest in the corner. She opened it, searching for anything that could be used as a weapon, her fingers brushing against hammers, saws, and old iron spikes. Tucked away in a leather pouch at the bottom, she found Frank's ledger, the small leather-bound book where he meticulously recorded every transaction, every penny spent, every dollar earned. She hadn't been able to bring herself to look at it since he died. She opened it now, a wave of grief washing over her as she saw his familiar, neat handwriting. She flipped through the pages idly, her mind on the coming battle. Then, a series of entries near the end caught her eye. They were different from the usual notes about feed prices and lumber costs. Corrigan, first payment, $200, rifles. Corrigan, second payment, $300, delivery to Fort Bowie, final disbursement, pending inspection. The name leaped off the page, Corrigan. "Kyle," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "Come here." He moved to her side, his eyes following her trembling finger as she pointed to the name. "This man, the one who was just here," she said, her mind struggling to connect the pieces. "His name is Bartholomew Corrigan. He's in my husband's ledger." Kyle looked from the book to her face, his expression grim. "What business did your husband have with a man like that?" "I don't know," she stammered. "Frank, he took on extra work sometimes, freighting goods for the army to make ends meet. He told me he was hauling supplies, tools, blankets." She trailed off, a cold dread seeping into her bones. She remembered Frank's last few weeks. He had been quiet, withdrawn, worried. He had spoken of a final shipment, a deal that would finally give them enough money to be secure. He had ridden out to meet a business partner and never came back. The official story was that his horse, laden with supplies, had stumbled in the arroyo, the rope tangled, and he was dragged. Kyle took the ledger from her, his gaze scanning the entries. He stopped at the words, "rifles," and Fort Bowie. "The army has been losing rifles," Kyle said slowly, his voice dark with a dawning realization. "Not from the armory, from the supply trains. Defective weapons, barrels that warp, firing pins that snap. They are sold as new, but they are factory rejects. Worthless in a real fight. Soldiers have died because their guns failed. My people have also found these rifles on the bodies of bounty hunters and prospectors." He looked at her, his eyes full of a grim understanding. This is Corrigan's business. He acquires condemned weapons, and your husband was the freighter, the man who made them look like legitimate army shipments. Corrigan gets them into the territory, then sells them to anyone with cash miners, settlers, even renegades. He profits from both sides of the war. The world tilted under Martha's feet. The image of her husband, honest, hard-working Frank, crumbled into dust. He wasn't just a freighter. He was a gun runner, a partner to a man like Corrigan. "No," she whispered, shaking her head. Frank wouldn't do that. Perhaps he did not know what he was carrying at first. Kyle said, his voice softening with a surprising gentleness. Or perhaps he found out and wanted to stop. And then the final terrible piece clicked into place. Frank's accident. Corrigan killed him. Martha said the words, tasting like ash. Frank must have confronted him or threatened to expose him. That final meeting, it wasn't about a payment. It was a murder. Corrigan wasn't just here for the bounty on Cale's head. He had come back for the ledger. It was the only proof of his scheme, the link between him and the faulty rifles. He must have assumed it was lost or destroyed, but now that he knew she was alive and well, he couldn't risk leaving it behind. His attack on her home wasn't just about finding an Apache. It was about tying up a loose end that was 2 years old. The grief for her husband was still there, but it was now twisted with a new searing anger. The man she had mourned was a stranger, a man caught in a web of greed and deceit, and the man who had murdered him was coming back to finish the job. She looked at Cale, the Apache warrior she had saved, the man her husband would have seen as an enemy. In a world of lies, he had been the one to show her the devastating truth. Her fight was no longer just about survival. It was about justice. It was for the memory of the man Frank should have been, and against the monster who had taken him from her. She closed the ledger and placed it carefully inside her dress. "He's not getting this book," she said, her voice ringing with cold iron, "and he's not leaving this valley alive." The ghost of Frank Collins had been laid to rest. In its place stood a woman with nothing left to lose and a score to settle. As true darkness finally fell upon the canyon, she picked up her shotgun, ready for the night to whisper a very different name. Corrigan's. And she would be the one to silence it for good. Nightfall did not creep into the canyon. It crashed down like a black wave, swallowing the last vestiges of light and plunging the homestead into an inky, profound darkness. The moon was a prisoner behind a veil of thick clouds. The only sounds were the chirping of crickets and the frantic beating of Martha's own heart. Inside the cabin, the lamp was extinguished. They waited in the dark, two disparate souls united against a common foe. Martha was positioned at the front window, her shotgun resting on the barricade. Kyle was a phantom, moving silently between the back window and the shadows near the hearth, his bow drawn, his senses stretched to their limit. They didn't have to wait long. The first sign was the sudden silence of the crickets. A moment later, a flicker of movement by the chicken coop. Not Corrigan. He was smarter than that. He had come back with 2 new men, hired guns from town, no doubt, and was using them as cannon fodder. 2 on the west flank. Kyle breathed, his voice a ghost in the darkness. Corrigan will come from the east, from the rocks. It is higher ground. He was thinking like a hunter, predicting his prey's movements. Martha focused on the west, her eyes straining to see past the edge of the porch. A floorboard on the porch groaned. One of the men was close, too close. She held her breath, waiting for the shape to resolve itself from the shadows. When it did, a hulking silhouette rising up to peer into the window, she didn't hesitate. She fired. The roar of the shotgun was deafening in the enclosed space. The window exploded inward in a shower of glass and splintered wood. A raw scream tore through the night, followed by the heavy thump of a body hitting the porch. One down. Gunfire erupted from the darkness. Bullets slammed into the log walls of the cabin, thudding like angry fists. Martha dropped to the floor, crawling to the other side of the room, as Kyle loosed an arrow towards the muzzle flashes. A choked cry answered him. 2 down. "He's at the rocks," Kyle hissed, pointing towards the small escarpment that overlooked the eastern side of the cabin. A rifle flash confirmed it. Corrigan was exactly where Kyle had predicted, pinning them down, trying to get a clean shot. "The lamp," Martha whispered urgently, an idea forming in her mind. Frank kept a spare full of oil in the pantry. Kyle understood instantly. While Corrigan was focused on the front of the cabin, Kyle slipped into the small pantry. He returned a moment later with the glass lamp and a rag. He worked quickly, stuffing the rag into the spout. A makeshift firebomb. "I need to get him off that ridge," Kyle said. "He has the advantage. Can you keep him busy?" Martha nodded, her face grim. She crawled back to the shattered front window. "Hey, Corrigan!" She screamed into the night, her voice filled with a raw, goading fury. "You murdered my husband. You came here to kill me. Are you going to hide in the rocks like a coward, or are you going to finish it?" Another shot from the ridge was her answer, the bullet whining past her head and burying itself in the wall behind her. It was the distraction Kyle needed. He slipped out the back door like a wisp of smoke, melting into the deeper shadows of the yard. Martha was alone. She reloaded the shotgun, her hands working by feel in the dark. She could hear Corrigan scrambling in the rocks, trying to get a better angle. He was being cautious now. He knew about the shotgun, but he didn't know where the Apache was. Minutes stretched into an eternity. The silence was worse than the gunfire. Then a sudden bright bloom of orange lit up the ridge. A scream of rage and pain echoed across the valley, Corrigan's voice. Kyle had thrown the lamp. It must have shattered on the rocks near him, splashing him with burning oil. Martha saw her chance. Corrigan was exposed, silhouetted by the flames, beating at his smouldering duster. She raised the shotgun, took aim at the dancing figure, and fired her second barrel. The kick of the gun slammed into her shoulder. The figure on the ridge stumbled, cried out, and then fell from sight behind the rocks. Silence returned. A heavy, final silence. Martha stayed where she was, her heart pounding, listening. Was it a trick? Was he playing dead? Then Cale appeared at the edge of the porch, his knife in his hand. He was breathing heavily, and there was a long, shallow gash on his arm, but he was alive. He looked at her, and in the faint, dying light of the fire on the ridge, she saw a profound respect in his eyes. Together they approached the rocks, moving with caution. Corrigan was there, sprawled on the ground at the base of the escarpment. He was alive, but barely. His clothes were singed, his leg was twisted at an unnatural angle from the fall, and the buckshot had torn into his side. He looked up at them, his pale eyes filled with hatred. "The ledger," he rasped, clutching at his bleeding side. "It's worthless. My word against a dead man's book." Martha reached into her dress and pulled out the small leather-bound ledger. She looked at Corrigan, the man who had destroyed her life, who had turned her husband into a ghost with a tarnished name. She felt no pity, only a vast, empty peace. "It's not for the law, Mr. Corrigan," she said, her voice cold and clear. "It's for me." She tossed the book into the last embers of the fire Kyle had started. The dry leather curled, blackened, and caught flame, turning 2 years of lies and secrets into smoke and ash. Corrigan watched it burn, a look of disbelief on his face. He turned his hateful gaze to Kyle. "You filthy savage," he choked out. Kyle simply looked down at him, his face impassive. He did not need to act. Corrigan was dying, and the land he had poisoned was now claiming him. They left him there and walked back to the cabin, the rising sun beginning to hint at its arrival in the east. They had survived the night. They buried the bodies before the sun was high in the sky, a grim, necessary task. When it was done, Kyle gathered his few things, his new bow, his knife. The time had come. "I cannot stay," he said, standing before her in the morning light. "Brody will come to investigate the gunshots. He will find the bodies. It is better if he finds only you, a widow, defending her home." Martha knew he was right. Their worlds could touch, they could even fight alongside one another, but they could not merge. To stay would mean death or capture for him, and ruin for her. "Where will you go?" she asked, her voice thick with an emotion she couldn't name. "To the mountains, to my people. I will tell them. I will tell them there is still courage in this world." He reached out his fingers, gently brushing a strand of hair from her face. His touch was warm, real. "You saved my life, Martha Collins. You fought like a lioness for your home. You have honored the ghost of your husband." Tears welled in her eyes, but she would not let them fall. She looked at him, the man she had dragged from a storm, the warrior she had healed, the ally she had fought with. The man whose presence had awakened a part of her she thought had died with Frank. The danger, the intimacy, the shared battle it had forged, a bond deeper than years of peaceful marriage. He turned to leave. He took 2 steps, then paused, his back to her. A soft breeze whispered through the canyon, carrying the scent of sage and rain-soaked earth. The night was over. The prophecy, she realized, had not yet been completely fulfilled. "Cale," she said, her voice soft, barely more than a breath. He stopped but did not turn. She said it again, this time for herself, a confirmation, a farewell, an acknowledgement of everything they had been through. A whisper, just as he had foretold. "Cale." He gave a slight, almost imperceptible nod. And then he was gone, disappearing into the rugged landscape as silently as he had arrived, leaving Martha Collins alone once more, but no longer just a widow. She was a survivor, a warrior, a woman who had faced down the darkness and whispered a name at the dawn. The story of Martha Collins and the Apache warrior Cale isn't one you'll find in the history books. It's a story written in blood and bullet holes on the wall of a forgotten cabin, a tale of an impossible bridge built between 2 worlds destined for conflict. It's a testament to the fact that courage isn't about the absence of fear, but about the choices we make in its presence. Martha chose compassion over prejudice, truth over comfortable lies, and a fight for justice over the safety of submission. In the heart of the unforgiving West, in a small, isolated homestead, 2 people who should have been enemies found a common humanity, proving that sometimes the greatest legends are the ones whispered only to the wind. If this story of courage and an unlikely bond in the Old West moved you, please take a moment to hit the like button. Share it with someone who appreciates tales of grit and the human spirit. And most importantly, subscribe to our channel for more stories that bring the echoes of the past to life. Thank you for listening.